All right, this is the Jack and Beren show. We've had some technical difficulties with the other podcast, so we're going to jump onto this.
You know what? You know how many professional level podcasts I've listened to though that have also come out and said we had some technical difficulties.
Yeah,
half of our show didn't get recorded, and
So yeah, Randy and I were on this great. Hitting some really awesome things, and then we realized that the podcast had actually frozen up on us. So we're going to try to go back and recap some of that because it was fantastic stuff. So we're going to go back and talk about what we were hitting on. We are going over today Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time, and it was just a fantastic book for me to go back. I hadn't read it since high school.
Yeah, I've never read it.
Randy said he had never read it, and so it was awesome to get in and to see how L'Engle was able to create such a book with lasting force. And I think that that's the true nature of a book for me, a piece of great literature, is its longevity.
Yeah.
Maybe it wasn't accepted in the beginning, but maybe it's accepted later on. People rediscover it. And it's about rediscovery.
Right.
And I think
we're 60 years past the publication date on this thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing is what kind of books, how many books really have that kind of lifespan to them.
And so the only way that I think a book can be rediscovered is if it has the correct atmosphere, because it pulls on a part of the human consciousness, which is actually the unconscious part of the human consciousness. And that can only be done when it has atmosphere that combines both imagination and reason. So some of the atmospheres that we talked about were space and spirituality.
Right.
And you mentioned something when we were recording a minute ago that I think I'd like you to go back over, was that you can get the science wrong, but actually you can create a good story with it.
Yeah.
If you remember what you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, so I was saying that we're gonna have to stop saying that like we were saying. we did previously record this, so we're going back in our own heads and trying to bring that forward. But this reminds me a lot of Lewis's space trilogy.
Absolutely.
And right around the same time, I think Lewis died in 1963 or 1964, sometime around then. This book was published in 1962. But it wasn't a whole lot longer before that he was writing his space trilogy. And so there's a lot of this book almost read to me like a combination of Lewis's space trilogy and Stranger Things.
Yeah.
Which there's a lot of, we could talk about some of those similarities there, but you got the Russians and you got the Soviets, and I almost heard synth music in my head a lot of times. But there's also this element that was shared with Lewis where we have not been out of this world yet. So important to remember when we're reading stuff that honestly, L'Engle, I mean, you can even look at the book and stuff like that. It's got good binding, good artwork, stuff like that. You almost could see this having been written in the 90s or early 2000s, and you have to realize, this is 60 years old. At this point, we've barely been in space. We hadn't even landed somebody on the moon at all. I mean, that we're really in this place culturally and nationally, and even just as a human species, where we're so interested in what's happening out there, but we don't really have a whole lot of concrete knowledge beyond some of the foundational science.
Because that's the unknown.
Yeah.
That's the unknown stuff. So there's the unknown of science, but we used the science. We used what we had, and we combined it with what we didn't know. And so L'Engle was able to use her imagination based on what she knew to try to bridge the gap into the unknown. And so we go from the conscious to the unconscious, and we try to bridge that gap. And I think that that's what the atmosphere that, to me, I was sold right away, because she's talking about adult concepts. Wrinkle in Time, the Tesseract, bending time to go across. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me that you can't get to these other planets because it would take too long unless you could bend time and then just step across. and like hyper jump and hyperspeed and all this that we have in Star Wars and Star Trek and all that.
Which as an aside, when I mentioned the Tesseract to my son, he said, "As in like Marvel?"
Right. Yes.
And I'm like,
yes.
"Oh, great! That's where we're getting the Tesseract from now." Yeah, it existed before Captain America.
It did. They've made it known, and so there's all these unknowns that she's pulling on, and to me, that atmosphere. Good writers create atmospheres that hit on that part of our unconscious. And if it does that, then it brings up this whole notion of sustainability. We're sitting out here on a piece of property that is magical and is gorgeous, and it's all these rolling green hills and it's forest, and the magic of the forest actually becomes more magical because I've seen the Ent forest.
Right.
I've seen the trees in Narnia that are alive. And I've seen the magic. So when I look at these trees, I see the magic within them. And you were talking about breathing, learning to breathe. And I want you to go into that because that concept for this book and other literature, I think, is so important.
So, I mean, you talking about the atmosphere, and that's obviously pulled even from some earlier discussions and podcasts where we've talked about, Tolkien and Lewis really pushing, the fact that good stories create a consistent atmosphere. That they create a world that you can get into, that you can stay in. It operates by rules. It's not our world merged with another world. It is its own world, and it operates by, its own laws, its own space, and its own atmosphere. And, I was thinking, I'm a hiker, and I like to go up and Mount Hood or some different places. I lived in the mountains for a little while, and one of the things you notice there is even in some rather short distances vertically, there's a different atmosphere level. Where we are right now in central Kentucky, we're kind of at a lower level atmosphere. But if we went out to Colorado or Portland or even somewhere in like the Smokies, and we go up a few thousand feet, all of a sudden we're going to realize like this is different breathing.
Yeah,
it's different quality of air. It may be harder to move a little bit. And you think about the Sherpas, in Nepal, man, I don't know how many thousands of feet that those guys are up, but if they were asked to come down to sea level, it would be a completely different atmosphere for them, just as if we were, trying to climb up Mount Everest, and it was like, it's an atmosphere we're not conditioned to. And I think that's, Lewis and Tolkien and L'Engle and the Inklings, like all of them really pull into this idea that good literature is not defined by its who it's written to,
right, categorized.
That they still should be written for everybody, so Narnia, yes, it's written to children, but it's also written for everybody. Scripture may be written to certain audiences, but it's for everybody. L'Engle, clearly with a lot of these like deep questions, these deep spiritual moral questions, it's maybe written to children, but it's for everybody. And that's why we have to be going back and reading these things. And, as I never got the experience growing up of reading things like Narnia and Wrinkle and
right.
and stumbling on these things as an adult, I realized for me there's a lot of acclimating to this atmosphere that I never was conditioned to as a child. And, I look at a lot of kids now who don't have, who were somewhat like me, but especially now, 30 plus years later, growing up in a fairly chaotic world, your atmosphere is never settled,
Yeah.
The spiritual atmosphere, the moral atmosphere, the educational atmosphere, the culture of fear and anxiety and depression and stuff like that we live in. How do we expect children to be able to breathe without giving them a foundational atmosphere to breathe in and take with them? And I think that's the beauty of these atmospheres is if a child can fall into this atmosphere and learn to breathe with it, then it'll be like a breathing pack on a new planet, Like you bring the atmosphere with you into hostile environments, into places that you can't breathe. There are places that are going to be difficult. It goes with you.
That is so good. I mean, that is... the equipping of young people. And so in today's society, we have not equipped kids, like you're saying, because the notion is literature today has to be woke. And I know we both, neither one of us like that word, but it's this idea, and woke means to be conscious. So if all literature is conscious, that means that the unconscious, which is the unknown, which is the chaotic, which is the imagination, is never conquered.
Yeah.
And if all you ever have is woke stuff and conscious stuff, then children are not going to know how to deal with the chaos in their mind. And so if you can't deal with the chaos in your mind, the only thing you can do is try to control the atmosphere outside of you.
Yep.
Well, that's impossible.
Yep.
It's impossible to control the world around you because you have another sentient being over there with free will and things that you can't control. And unless you can control them, then everything's chaos.
It's like trying to create an Earth-like atmosphere on Mars. Like, you can't do that.
Right.
You can bring part of the atmosphere to survive in a space that would be hostile to Earth's atmosphere. But anybody that looks at that kind of science and that sort of space exploration knows, like, there's not enough oxygen in the world, there's not enough water in the world that we can create another Earth there.
Right.
We can create places for it, but you'll always still live in a place that's going to be hostile to that. And I think that's where we are in a very postmodern, post-Christian, even though I'm actually kind of glad that we're in that space now where we're post-Christendom. But as our kids are growing up in that world, we have to be able to give them good books, good theology, good philosophy, good spirituality to put on their backs so that they can breathe in what is an otherwise very confusing, daunting world.
There's
a lot of different atmospheres.
There's a lecture by Jordan Peterson, not a lecture, but there's sort of an interview between Jordan Peterson and Sir Roger Scruton that is one of the greatest literature expositions I've ever heard. It was just amazing. But Sir Roger says that great literature blows on the embers inside of us, and we hope they catch flame.
Yeah.
And so what I see is in literature like The Wrinkle in Time is it does give children and adults, but children, the ability to have this thing inside of them come to life. They come more to life. Mm-hmm. If all you have is a conscious life, then even Paul says, if we have a hope in this life only, we're most miserable. There has to be a transcendent quality to life, because if we're created for another world, then there has to be that connection to that. And I think this literature connects us to the imagination and allows us to grapple with the unknown. And like you say, if we can go into Narnia and defeat the White Witch with Aslan, then we can come back to this world and defeat evil.
Yeah.
If we can defeat it on a strange planet and through a wrinkle in time, then when we come back to our world, we're equipped. We know that's evil. What defeats evil? I know what defeats evil.
Yeah.
And so you have these things inside of us that are these themes and these archetypes that are hit, these unknown things that are hit, and they ring true. Like when you see stars, you're like, oh, that could be Miss Watson. That could be what it's like, music and all these things that pull on us. And so, and you mentioned equipping our kids, and so I was talking about my son Lex, and he has a great eye for literature, and he actually is a great writer at 7 years old, and I've read tons of literature. And my son said the first time that he read Narnia and Mr. Beaver said, Aslan's on the move, he said, my cheeks exploded, my hair got tight. And I was like, what an experience to have at 7, to have touched the transcendent, unknown truth at 7 years old and have a visceral, physical experience to that.
Well, it's like breathing. It's like taking a deep breath in an atmosphere that you know so well, where you get the pure air, you get the clean air. All of a sudden you've been stifled, and and all of a sudden you get to the top of the mountain and you take that big deep breath, and it's like you know that this is what you live for.
Yeah,
it's clean, it's spiritual, it's existential.
And one of the things that Alistair McGrath says that C.S. Lewis does so well because we talked about equipping kids, and so they're able to breathe, they're able to take this oxygen in, and they're able to go, this is what it's like to be human. This is truth, and they breathe it in, and it becomes a part of them, and then they realize that the rest of the time, the rest of the world's trying to choke that away, and so when they read a book that lets them breathe, he says, but what it does. Alistair McGrath says in his book about C.S. Lewis, A Life, he said that Lewis never tells the reader, let's put it that way, never tells the reader who's good and who's bad.
Yeah.
He leaves it open to interpretation. And he says, you, as a reader, need to flex your muscle and go, let me judge these characters based on their behaviors and their actions and the outcomes.
Yeah.
Well, Queen Jadis, queens are good and some queens are bad. How do I know if she's good or bad? Let's look at her actions.
Yeah.
Aslan, he seems pretty rough sometimes. Is he good or bad? Let me look at his actions. And so children begin to flex that muscle and begin to learn how to breathe and judging things based on the outcomes and the behaviors.
Well, I mean, turning this to Langle, you I think it's probably 3/4 of the way through the book when Charles Wallace is, he's become possessed by.
Yes.
And we're throwing out spoiler alerts, and so hopefully people will pick this up and read it, or if they already have. But Charles Wallace becomes possessed by this thing, and as Meg is sitting there and she's trying to bring him back, he starts giving her these lines about how it is actually good, how Miss What's-It and Miss Witch and Miss Who, they're the bad ones, they're the ones that are trying to trick her, but it is the one that's actually like,
yeah,
it's the, and you see her kind of wrestling with that a little bit, but she keeps landing on like, no, I know just by the way that, and even in reading through this, you start to see, and this is where I said, like, it's kind of like Stranger Things-ish and stuff like that, very 80s-ish, is everybody's operating according to the same rhythms, everybody's walking the same, there's that scene where, they open up the door and everybody steps their, head out the door at the exact same time, and
the balls are bouncing in unison.
The balls are bouncing in unison and stuff like that, and those are things that you immediately, you don't have to be told that those are bad, you feel it,
Oh, yes.
This is not okay, and there's nothing really on the face of it that should tell us that balls bouncing at the exact same time, is a bad thing. In fact, I would think that we would say, just kind of like in conjunction with how its worldview kind of perpetuated this idea that actually it's balls bouncing at two different times. It's balls bouncing in chaos and things like that. That's the bad. It's unison that's actually the good thing. It's everybody doing the exact same thing, being in conformity. That's the good thing, right? Is the other, it's different
yes.
Bad. Similar is good, and yet at the same, all of us are reading this and we're like, no.
It comes over you as in a wave going, oh, that's wrong.
Yeah.
Like your eye tells you, no, this is not how it's supposed to be.
And so that shapes things. Like, of course, she's writing this in the midst of, the Cold War and Soviet Union and the U.S., and that's informing a lot of the way that people kind of see, like, how communism and Soviet Russia operates and totalitarianism. Like, this is not okay. We should have balls bouncing at the same time. People should have that different, should be coming out their houses at different points. People should be doing the exact same job. We should have freedom and liberation, and we recognize that, yes, even though it may be different, that's actually a better thing. That's not the black thing. That's the white thing. That's the stars, right? Like
that's one of the themes is free will.
Yep.
In this, what does free will look like, and what would you give up? Would you give up free will for security?
Yeah.
And in the granddaughter actually said that the theme of the balls bouncing was not an allusion to Soviet, but it was she wasn't thinking about the Soviets when she actually wrote that.
Yeah.
But we can see that.
We can see that.
And we look at that and go, yeah, that is wrong. And so the whole notion in all of all of humanity is the wrestling between security and free will, and comfort and free will. And there's a trade-off.
Right.
What will you... And some people will be willing to get rid of because free will requires personal responsibility. Security doesn't require that, but security costs way more. Any failure on free will and responsibility, any personal failure, any catastrophic failure, actually costs less than the totalitarian security will cost you in your humanity. Like, so another theme here that we can pull on is loss and grief. And I think that loss and grief is throughout the entire book.
Yeah.
And pulling on with your free will and security, if you give up free will, you will lose more of your humanity than you will ever gain in security.
Yeah.
And I think that was, and I think both Lewis and Tolkien, I mean, if you think about even the Hobbits and giving up the Shire, giving up security, and then you go into Narnia, they're giving up their home, and they're giving up these things, and there's loss, and there's battle, and there's always evil. And there's this notion that I was listening to Jordan Peterson talk about this, because those of you that don't know Jordan Peterson, actually is not very political. It just, one of his talks became political. Most of the stuff he talks about is about literature and psychology, and it's just fantastic stuff. He's actually more apolitical than he is political. But he actually talks about a Jungian principle. This Jungian principle is that what you most need is in the place that you don't want to look for it. And that actually one of the themes that Wrinkle pulls on here is one of the, he calls one of the most ancient stories in all of human history. And I thought it was very interesting. Once I saw this, I was like, oh, you go to Pinocchio, it's in Pinocchio. Mm-hmm. It's in all of these stories. It's that you have to go into the belly of the beast to rescue the ancient spirit of the father.
Right.
And you see that and you go, oh, that pulls on that unconscious desire in us to rescue the ancient spirit of the father inside of us that we lost in the fall. That connection to the father, that's what we're constantly trying to get back to. And any story that pulls on that is going to bring us into relatability of what it means to be human. We lost something.
Which is really interesting, too, just to put that in the broader theological concept that, you know, we could never go into the belly of the beast. That God himself had to go in the belly of the beast in order to bring that back, you know. And so as much as we try and strive for that, you know, even here, and I mean, sometimes people will write off Wrinkle because she's a Christian author, and I know that there's gripes about the movies and stuff like that because of some of the theology, but she continues to lean on, like, you can only do this as God allows you. You can only do this with the strength of God. You can only do this because he's calling you to a specific purpose and because he's with you, because without that, without God being with you, you know, and so this is not a secular humanist book, you know. It's not like it's not a secular humanist space travel book or you know, stuff like that. Like, it's rooted. It's still supposed to be rooted in a world that, though it looks very different than ours, and you got the Tesseract, and you got, you know, space travel, and you got these planets that operate and these creatures that, you know, operate out there. It's still is fundamentally, like Tolkien's universe, still fundamentally a Christian world.
Right.
And man, it's just that fact. Like I like what you're saying there, and I also like, you know, as you mentioned, that she wasn't writing about this isn't an allegory for the Cold War, but yet we're able to see that because it's touching on these issues of free will and determinism. And I think the takeaway on all of this is, you know, the very fact that becomes a suspicion that maybe she was writing allegorically on this is actually her one of her main points in all of this, is that you should be able to take this atmosphere, lay it over something, and see if it conforms or doesn't conform to what resonates with you. So yeah, it may be Soviet Russia, it may be the U.S. today, you know, it may be political, it may be theological, you know. I mean, determinism, you know, at a theological level also hits me in a gut, like, it's just not quite right, you know. Like, it fits us in a proleptic in an eschatological way.
Yeah.
Is that what we mean by God coming back and the world and heaven coming together? Does it mean that we lose human freedom and we all of a sudden become predictable and the same in conformity? Or that doesn't resonate with me either, And so it's like she's giving us basically a template to look at the rest of the world. Lewis is giving us a template. Tolkien is giving us a template. That's what's so great about this mid-20th century stuff, is they're laying out this template through imagination and saying, you can take this template, which is fundamentally a Christian worldview, and analyze all aspects of reality by it.
Yeah, that was again, that was brilliant, and the way you brought that forward.
As Paul says, you don't. Good philosophical thinking is philosophy that agrees with, the Christian worldview. Otherwise, it's dependent upon human conceptions, human principles, human motives, human desires, and all of those can construct, the realities that like the it is built out of.
And you see that, and so because it's imagination and reason. Tolkien, Lewis, L'Engle, in my estimation, they take their epistemology and they anchor it to as much ontological truth as they can get their hands on.
Yep.
And that's the template they're giving us. And what we see today, and what we see it doing in there, is we see them anchoring their epistemology to their epistemology and acting like they've done something. And in today's world, we come through and we say, well, my truth. Well, you're just taking your epistemology and you're anchoring it to your epistemology. That doesn't apply. That only applies to you. The law of identity says that only applies to you. So your truth actually is abrogated, and it actually is concentrated only to you, and it doesn't apply. So if I read someone's anecdotal story of their life, and I read this anecdotal story and their epistemology, and they say, this is my truth, that cannot apply to my life, because it's not anchored to any shared human experience or any ontological shared human experience.
Yeah.
They try to come through and say, here's what we know about reason, and let me anchor this to where I can. And you and I know, and I was telling my son the other day, because my son's starting to get up on philosophy where his sister is, and I have twins, and I was telling him, I said, buddy, there are only 3 thoughts about how existence came to be. There are only three thoughts. Necessity, chance, or design. That's it. That's all we've been able to come up with is 3 thoughts. There's only 3 thoughts about God. God is everything. There is one God. There is no God. That's it. Everything else derives from those thoughts. And if we realize that we can narrow down thinking and begin to say, there are not a billion ways to think about God. There's 3. Now, how do you want to go with it?
Right.
And you begin to anchor those things down, and suddenly the world becomes less chaotic because you understand what you're trying to do philosophically, and you understand that just because you have a thought doesn't mean it's a good thought. And L'Engle gives us that template to place over and go, okay, let me see what that, oh yeah, that doesn't make any sense. It can't be good.
Yeah.
It can't be good.
And just to bring that back to, where we started, right, about this concept of the atmosphere, template, atmosphere, however you want to call it. I don't think those are fully interchangeable, but they would speak into one another.
Yeah.
That's really the question that these books are really designed to answer, is what kind of atmosphere, what kind of template do you want to grow up with? And which one conforms to the realities, right? You mentioned ontology, right? This idea of what is real, what is true, what truly exists. And so L'Engle would say, just like Tolkien and Lewis, that there is a real world. They're not postmodernists. It's not your truth. There is the truth, and all of these things are basically meant. And this is the beauty of fiction. Fiction sometimes is, but good fiction is always still going to perpetuate, even through made-up characters and events and situations and things like that. It's the truth isn't made up. The truth is still
yes.
The truth is still true, despite the fact that all the situation, characters, stories,
yes,
sentences, all that kind of stuff.
It's a great distinction.
Those are made up, but the truth is still there. And so the atmosphere between the world that we live in, that we're living in right now and speaking in right now, is actually the same atmosphere that is in A Wrinkle in Time, that is in Narnia, that is in which, and just as an aside, there's always been this little question for me. I've been like, how are these people breathing? They go to Ransom goes to Mars, Venus, and I'm like, they don't have the same atmosphere. We have oxygen. What are they doing? They got to slap on these, their oxygen tanks. No, they don't. They can breathe, right? Langel's characters, they can breathe, right? And it's that may be just like a symbol, a metaphor for the fact that like these worldly conceptions still operate by the way that what is real.
Well, it's sort of modalistic in the sense of it's a possible world.
Yeah.
And it's like a dream. When you go to a dream, I can breathe underwater in a dream.
Yep.
I shouldn't be able to, but I can swim around and breathe endlessly underwater. And so I think it's that notion of this is a possible world. This is a way for us to test out our epistemology. Mm-hmm. Does your epistemology work in this atmosphere? Let's create this atmosphere. Does your epistemology work? And when people go there and they find out, oh, my thing doesn't work here. Well, if it doesn't work there, modal logic would say it probably can't work here.
Right.
And that gets into the ontological argument of God. Does God exist? Is it possible that God exists in a possible world?
Right.
Well, he does. So if he exists in a possible world, he exists in all worlds. And so you go through and you say, can this exist in a possible world? Yeah, it can. Well, and then you go through the process of saying, well, could this exist in the real world? And if it could, then the lessons you learn there are applicable here.
Yep.
And they inform your epistemology and going through that. And you brought up the fact that that we can't defeat the it. We can't defeat darkness. We went to the belly of the beast, but it wasn't to defeat it. Christ went into the belly of the beast to defeat it.
Yep.
So, which I thought was an interesting point for me, was she went to save her father and she went to save Charles Wallace. She did not go to defeat it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a cool distinction in there to go. She went to the belly of the beast not to destroy it, but to find herself.
Right.
And she did. She found out who she was. And she was able to save someone from that notion. And there was also a really cool scene where Calvin tries to console Meg after she's seen the darkness. Remember, they go up in the atmosphere of that planet and they actually get to see the darkness. When she comes back down, she's inconsolable.
Right.
Calvin tries. Now, the whole trip up there, Calvin has been keeping her calm, and that human relationship is actually keeping her comforted.
Right.
But the minute that she sees the darkness, Calvin's comfort is no longer enough. She actually has to go to Miss Witch, or Miss Who's It, or Miss What's It. I can't remember which one. One of the three.
One of the three.
And I can't remember because they
it's a little. That's the most confusing part.
Yeah, Anyway, but once, I think it was Miss Witch, and once she is in the embrace of Miss Witch, peace comes over her. She needed divine comfort.
Yep.
Once she saw the darkness and she encountered true darkness and true evil, she could only be comforted by the divine presence.
Right.
And I thought that was a great illustration there of human relationship can comfort you to a level, but once you actually encounter true evil, the only thing that can combat that actually is the divine.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to end this one here.
Yeah.
That's the rule. No matter what culture and what world, what reality it is that you read, that's the truth that you should be able to take out of all of these stories is, that there is a, amidst all the chaos, amidst the different, that we can't do it. I mean, that's the difference between this kind of literature and humanistic literature is we can't save ourselves.
Well, every religion but Christianity points to the fact that you can. Yeah. And even some Christian denominations loosely even point to themselves as the arbiter of their salvation.
Yeah.
And you just realize that you don't have it. You have things inside of you that you're stronger than you know, but you're not as strong as you think you are. It's that paradox.
Yeah.
and coming to the place of realization. So yeah, we'll stop on this one. We'll pick back up because I think there's some more themes that we want to touch on and L'Engle, and we'll come back for part 2. This has been the Jack and Beren Show. I've been Jack.
I've been Beren.
And we'll talk to you guys in a little bit.